Hello, this is chapter 18 from the AMSCO book, The Growth of Cities in American Culture. Again, I'm bringing to you my slides, the ones I made based on the notes I took in this chapter. I wanted to start out this chapter with a quote from a book called The Devil in the White City. It's a pretty famous book, and the book is great. It has it's kind of a mixed story between telling the story of the Chicago World's Fair exposition, and it also tells the story of around that time, the first serial killer in the United States. It's a really crazy story about what the serial killer did. But in any case, it's in this environment of the growth of this new city. So I had to pick out this quote because it's crazy. Check it out. The firm that they're referring to in the first sentence here is the architectural firm, which gets hired to design the Chicago World's Fair. As the firm grew, so did the city. It got bigger, taller, and richer. It also got dirtier, darker, and more dangerous. A miasma of cinder-flecked smoke blackened its streets and at times reduced visibility to the distance of a single block, especially in winter when coal furnaces were in full roar. The ceaseless passage of trains, grip cars, trolleys, carriages, surreys, landaus, Victorias, Brighams, phaetons, and hearses, all with ironclad wheels that struck the pavement like rolling hammers, produced a constant thunder that did not recede until after midnight and made the open night windows of summer unbearable. In poor neighborhoods, garbage mounded in alleys and overflowed giant trash boxes that became banquet halls for rats and blue bottle flies, billions of flies. The corpses of dogs, rats, and horses often remained where they fell. In January, they froze into disheartening poses. In August, they ballooned and ruptured. Many ended up in the Chicago River, the city's main commercial artery. During heavy rains, river flowed in a greasy plume far out into Lake Michigan to the towers that marked the intake pipes for the city's drinking water. In rain, any street not paved with macadam oozed a fragrant muck of horse manure, mud, and garbage that swelled beneath the granite blocks and pus like a wound. Chicago awed visitors and terrified them. French editor Octave Buzyn called it the Gordian City, so excessive, so satanic. Phil Landau, an author and publisher, described it as a gigantic peep show of utter horror, but extraordinarily to the point. So Chicago is a perfect example of what when we talk about the growth of the American city, because Chicago is a newer city than New York City, so it's home to a lot of these new developments that we're going to talk about. So in the World's Fair in 1893, we often talk about the Gilded Age as having, on the surface it looked good and it looked gold, right? The surface looked gold, but underneath was rotten. Well, the World's Fair kind of World's Fair kind of exemplified this, right? Is that the World's Fair was an attempt to be the model city, the ideal urban environment, to show off our technological process and electrification. But then that represented the white city, the new glowing, shining example of what we could be. But Chicago was also the gray city. So while we had skyscrapers, department stores, theaters, factories, warehouses, and streetcars, we also had a rash of pollution, poverty, and crime. One commentator called it worse than the Tower of Babel, referencing the biblical story. And Chicago was just a center of industrialization, immigration, and urbanization. We're going to focus on these last two. So the streets, if you look at the city itself, it doesn't look anything, it looks very similar to, you look at downtown Newark, right? The buildings, the facades are still there. But we see the horses instead of the typical cars that you'd see today. So in terms of immigration, we're going through what's called the second wave of immigration. But between 1850 and 1900, the US population triples. And whenever you think about immigration, you have to think about these push and pull factors. Push factors are people that push people out of countries and into the United States, and pull factors are ones that entice immigrants to come here. So push factors are the poverty of farm workers and political turmoil, urbanization leading to overcrowding and joblessness in European countries, But there's other pull factors. There's reputation for religious freedom and economic opportunities out west, and the industrial jobs, and also the fact that there's inexpensive one-way travel on the boats crossing the Atlantic and the Pacific. So we have the old versus new immigrants. So this is a picture of sort of the anti-Irish attitudes, but the old Northern and Western Europeans were what we call the old immigrants. Britain, Germany, Scandinavia, Ireland. Except for Ireland, these were mostly Protestant, and they came to the United States relatively skilled. The new immigrants, which spanned from what we call 1890 to World War One, these were coming from primarily Eastern and South Europe, so Italian, Greek, Croats, Poles, Russians. They were poor and illiterate with very few skills, and their religion was Orthodox and Jewish, so Orthodox Christian. So that's where we get to the idea of the religious freedom, that they were coming to not be persecuted for it. And then we also have this concept of the birds of passages, where younger men were sent to work like in the United States to send enough money to bring the rest of the family over. Many stories, even modern day, have the same thing where a family member is sent to the United States in the hopes to raise enough money to bring the family over. So here's where we start to see these restrictions on immigration coming out of anytime we have a wave of immigration. There's usually a wave of nativist sentiment. Not all of it was, racist, but as I'll explain here. So we had the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was racist. That was specifically targeting Chinese people because they were coming in and taking jobs in the mining sectors in China. And there were a growing population in San Francisco and other cities in China. We had a contract labor law, which restricted temporary workers, required medical examinations and taxes paid to come to the United States. Labor unions didn't like it because that was the cheap labor that was coming in, and that was undermining the efforts to raise wages for workers. Nativists like the American Protective Association opposed new immigrants coming in, and the social Darwinists, the idea that these people aren't as good as Americans here, right? They should not enter the United States because of it. Another thing is that anytime we see a financial panic, it always puts pressure on immigrants because immigrants get blamed for taking jobs, as this is a perennial issue. And so when people are out of work, they tend to blame people who they think are taking their jobs. But by 1900, though, 15% of the US population are immigrants. And this leads to a vast process of urbanization, or immigrants are moving to the cities primarily. It provided labor for factories, it made finished goods. And another factor here in this urbanization process is later on, this spans after World War I, after we kind of close the doors, is that African Americans are going to move to the northern cities in what's called the Great Migration. So a lot of these things are overlapping with each other to create the patchwork of people in the modern city. So there are the Chinese workers working in the mines, and there we have the seeing the Statue of Liberty outside of New Jersey. Changes in the nature of cities. So they became streetcar cities. Transportation opened up commuting opportunities. So you could have these little trolley cars. It looks kind of like the light rail today, where they would go from the suburbs to the city centers. And technological advances like steel gave us the Brooklyn Bridge, and we have a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge here being constructed. Yeah. And one of the things, though, that I found incredibly interesting was that commuting fueled segregation. There's this idea of de jure versus de facto segregation. De jure means it's by law. So down in the South, there was de jure segregation, that blacks were separated from whites. But in the northern cities, is what we have de facto segregation. Wealthier people could flee pollution, immigrants, they could flee based on class, race. Basically, they had the ability to move out of cities. And so these new technological advances allowed them to still have their jobs in urban centers while still being while still being able to distance themselves as well. Other technological innovations here, with the skyscrapers, we have steel construction, the use of elevators, and central heating. And so as these immigrants moved into these neighborhoods, they're moving into their own like little settlements within the, if you think about, like, there's Chinatowns in many cities. There's in New York, there's Little Italy. There's all these little patchwork of places which represent different ethnicities. But back when this was being developed, they had what's called tenement housing. And after a law in 1879, they had to have a window in each room. So think about, there were some people who lived in places that did not have any windows. Overcrowding led to cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis. But the one thing it did do is provided a cultural center for various immigrant groups, right? So they were able to kind of stick with the culture that they knew and were able to speak their own language. In residential suburbs in Europe, it was kind of the opposite. The wealthy lived in town, right? The wealthy people lived in town, and the poor people lived in rural outskirts. And this is the opposite in the US, where the wealthy are going to start to live outside of the city and the poor are going to live inside the city. Why is it? Why is this happening in the United States? Well, there's this abundant, cheap land, inexpensive transportation. There's a low cost of construction, building new houses. Also because of racial prejudice, they wanted to distance themselves from the different groups that are moving into the city. And there's a desire for privacy and detached housing. Right? And then we also have Frederick Law Olmsted, who's an architect and designer, and he wanted to design like kind of, the picture of the village in the park. So it's like, if you imagine how there's sort of these grassy lawns and like a house plopped in the middle of a grassy lawn, and like, it's, if you think about it, it's like a village in a park. There's housing and there's all this grassland surrounding it, swooping lines. Looks, like a park. There's the private versus public city. So when the government didn't have much control over what the city was doing, it led to mismanagement. There was issues with water purification, sewage, waste, police, lighting, and zoning laws. As you might have seen in that quote that I opened up with, it was disgusting. There wasn't any central planning of like how to clean up these things because they had to raise taxes in order to do that. But there was a movement called the City Beautiful movement where they wanted to establish public parks and public attractions to make the city, to improve it. Right? So the picture that I have here is connected to the tenement housing. So they redesigned the tenement housing to have what are called dumbbell housing. And so this was a lot in New York. And so you'd have the apartments on either side here, and in the middle you'd have a court, quote unquote, but it really was just an air shaft. And so you'd have a window, but you really wouldn't go out to see anything. And people often dumped their trash in the court, and it was disgusting. So the Boston machine politics. So as people were flooding into the city, this was an opportunity to get some political power in the city due to the voting. We'll talk about that. Lincoln Steffens wrote about the corruption between the municipal city and big business in The Shame of the Cities, because the city governments started to abuse their ability to raise funds. So through this system called the political machines. So what a political machine is, right? Think about a machine, how a machine works. Something needs to go in and something needs to come out, right? And it fuels itself. So in a political machine, what's coming in? Well, a political machine is going to, there's a political party that's in power. And in this case, it's going to be the Democrats in these northern cities. They're going to promise jobs and early forms of welfare. They're going to help out these immigrant groups. Traditionally, they were Irish before, but now they're going to start to reach out to other ethnic neighborhoods. These people are going to help these people out in exchange for votes. And so when these uh, so when there's a contract that comes up to get work, and you are close with the if you know that you're close with the political party in the city, you could go to the political boss, the party boss, and say, hey, I need a job, and he might get you a job, right? So it was a self, and then but the promise was that you would then vote for them and keep them in power. So a machine politics is that there's an assumption that these people are going to stay in power, and that they're going to use that in order to help their citizens. It sounds like a good thing, but what happens is we get this thing called graft. So we see here that George Washington Plunkett favored what's called honest graft, meaning that he cites an example where, if we're going to build a new school, and there's land available, and if I buy the land before the government gets it, and I sell it back to the government for more money than I paid for it, well, that's just me finding the right opportunity. But most people would see that as pretty corrupt today, because he would have the inside information. The big figure here is Boss Tweed. That's the guy in this kind of center left here. This guy, the big guy, favored dishonest graft, bribery, stole over $200 million. And because of this cartoonist named Thomas Nast, Thomas Nast was publicizing this guy's crimes and making sure that he was being exposed for the issues that were going on in his city. And he was found out, discovered in Cuba. So while there was this dishonesty, there was this massive growth within the cities. They did help develop and build public schools and playgrounds and other spaces. So there was some development there. It wasn't all bad. So as we see these dramatic changes with wealth and inequality, there were these social criticisms, like Henry George, who said that we should, instead of taxes on income, we should replace taxes on land, because people who own land had more wealth. Edward Bellamy envisioned a cooperative society if he agreed in crime in his book 1887. And mostly these were calls for government regulation, coming in and fixing this problem of wealth inequality. One of the other reformers here that you need to know, you got to know, the settlement houses with Jane Addams. Jane Addams set up shop in Chicago, where she would teach English, early childhood education, theater, industrial arts, and music, and they became what's called a social workers. They advocated for child labor laws, housing reform, women's rights, and temperance. So one of the things that gets discussed with Jane Addams was, were they trying to Americanize these immigrants? We'll talk about that at the end of this. Another concept was this idea of the social gospel, social justice, preaching social justice in religion to motivate suburban middle class to assist the poverty-stricken neighborhoods. Families in urban life, there was a lot of strain on parents due to the distance from extended family and village support. So living in a city didn't always give you the luxuries of childcare that you'd normally expect. Divorce increased because legislation allowed for what's called for the reasons for cruelty and desertion. And there was a overall reduction in family size. So you think on a farm, children are there to assist the people on a farm. Children in a city, provided that they're not going to school or going to work, are kind of they're a burden. So we see some continuity and change with this idea of the voting rights for women. So remember back in 1848, we had the Seneca Falls Convention advocating for women's rights. And in 1890, we see the development of NAWSA. This is the National American Women's Association. In Wyoming in 1869, women have the right to vote in local and state elections. And then we also, this expands in 1900. They could own property after marriage. And so there is this push during this reform era, early reform era, and this continues on much into what we call the progressive era that we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks. But know that this doesn't come out of anywhere. It gets developed here in this Gilded Age. We see another thing that's kind of tied to this. This was the idea that the women's rights are getting votes in the West, and that they want to spread it east. There is this push for temperance, not drinking, and by this time, 21 states close saloons and bars. Right, doesn't mean that drinking stops, absolutely, but that there's a push to make alcohol illegal. And as I look into future chapters, this is a major issue that divides Republicans and Democrats about whether or not to legalize alcohol. And it reminds me of the issue of the marijuana debate, where Republicans typically want to keep it illegal and Democrats typically want to make it more legal. We see a lot of intellectual movements. We do start to see the implementation of public schools, compulsory tax-supported high schools. In higher education, we see that there's something called land-grant colleges established through what are called the Morrill Acts. Not moral like morals, but like MORRILL Acts. These are we also see wealthy philanthropists like Rockefeller establishing universities like the University of Chicago. We see the growth of colleges for women, Smith, Bryn Mawr, and Mount Holyoke. And more electives are opened up, and they emphasize research. So colleges become not just a place for wealthy elites to go and get a degree in some profession, but to expand the concept of colleges is meant to be, because of the growth of the sciences, they want to fuel that scientific research. We also see more socially, we see the growth of the fraternities and sports. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. In the social sciences, they use the scientific method in the study of evolution that led to more of a study of humankind: psychology, sociology, anthropology, political science. And they wanted to study behavior rather than these abstract theories about human behavior. In the professions, things began to evolve a little bit, became a little bit more open and progressive. Oliver Wendell Holmes said that laws should evolve with the time. Clarence Darrow argued that criminal behavior was a result of the environment. And W.E.B. Du Bois, who we talked about in a previous chapter, wanted to study the crime in urban areas. And this allowed them to help develop more progressive policies. Oh, this is a map of the land-grant colleges. If you look deeply, the ones that are in the starred ones and the ones that are red are coming through this Morrill Acts colleges. Oh, and there's this is the Rutgers versus Princeton game. So the first college football game was played by Rutgers versus Princeton. So a continuation, we see the American literature come full bloom. This is Mark Twain and the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Some have argued this is the best American novel ever written, but we can argue about that. Stephen Crane also exposed some of the issues going on in urban areas with Maggie, a Girl on the Streets, and Jack London's Call the Wild. It was sort of this discussion, this thinking about nature versus civilization. It's a really interesting book. I encourage you to read it. Most cities had an orchestra, an opera house, and an outdoor bandstand. This is where we get the music of John Philip Sousa. It's not going to record my screen. Let's see if I can get. Let's see here. Let's see real quick. Yeah, can't get my audio working. John Philip Sousa, The Stars and Stripes Forever. I'll post a link to it in the Maple Leaf Rag, or other popular music during this time period. They also mentioned in the chapter that this is the beginning of the blues and jazz. That's going to come a little bit later in the cities in the teens and 20s, but yeah, this is where we start to get those movements as well. There's like the marching band, and there's Scott Joplin. So popular culture, really important here is that we get these new newspapers that start to promote what's called sensationalism. And the figures here are Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst. And they start to popularize some of these news stories. The one here, this is going to be connected to when our discussion of the uh, war the oh my gosh, the Spanish American War. Sorry, this is of the Spanish American War, where they are actively promoting this issue and trying to get people to get excited about this. Uh, in popular culture too, we also see the gradual reduction in the hours people work. So this might seem kind of counterintuitive because the story that I've mostly been telling is that the workers are being abused. The lower class people have been working in jobs that require them to work 16 hours a day without, and unions struggling to, right? That is true. But we also have that's sort of the lower class worker. The other class of workers here, the middle class workers, the professionals, they're starting to get more leisure time. Because of improved transportation and promotional advertisement, there's more of attractions to go to. There's the theaters, comedies, and vaudeville, Barnum and Bailey and Buffalo Bill Wild West shows, and you can go see a baseball game. And drinking was pretty popular during the time period, despite the push to get it abolished. And also the decline of Victorian values that discourage wasting time. People started to relax a little bit more, at least for that social class. There's an old baseball card. So here is sort of the historiographical question. Is the United States, or just during this time period, was this a melting pot or a cultural diversity? To what extent did immigrants give up their heritage to become Americanized? So in the early 20th century, the view was that groups quickly assimilated, that they became American. But this has been argued, and this is what we call the melting pot. They've all like melted into one American stew. Whereas Carl Degler has argued, historian has argued that it's more like a salad bowl, that we're just independent pieces kind of tossed together. Oscar Hamlin wrote about this that said that immigrants were alienated from both their native culture and American culture, and that assimilation actually took place over generations. So it wasn't the first wave of immigrants or the first generation of immigrants, it was the subsequent ones that kind of blended in. Richard Wade points out that this was not the case for African Americans. So while while American society kind of created this class of white American that's blended the Eastern Europeans and the Western Europeans together, we still segregated out African Americans. Diverse groups kept together, were coming together, kept apart by intergroup hostility, crime, or corruption. One of the questions that we can think about is this, will this naturally occur in the future? Will cultural divisions now break down over time? In the ways in which the United States' society is fractured today, will we become a whole society, or will the existent racism and anti-immigrant attitudes, will that just stick around for these groups in particular? And we'll have to see. So one of the questions that I have here, explain the impact of industrialization on the growth of cities and the shift in population, both in terms of immigration and urbanization. So if you wanted to lay out an LEQ answer for this question, so the growth of cities brought jobs, which induced immigrants to come into the cities in particular because these factories were located in urban centers. This also brought a diverse group of immigrants coming to the United States. So they were creating their own little pockets of societies within these large cities. Industrialization, the growth of cities, shift in population. The other shift in population that we'd have to consider is the shift of the middle class to the suburban centers, I should say, or suburban areas, right? That as the immigrants were coming into the city, the wealthy were coming out. In what ways and to what extent did industrialization and urbanization create a new American culture? So I think that we can argue that this creates a dynamically way new different American culture due to the fact that we see a um, industrialization, urbanization create a new American culture. I actually have to think about that. Create a new American culture. What was new? So the new parts of the American culture was this new patchwork of diverse groups coming to the United States. And so, yes, so I would argue that this is a new composition, there's new types of people coming to the United States, creating a new American culture. And I would center the argument probably around what the new city had to offer, right? What the new city had, its theaters, had its uh, uh, had its shows, had its spectator sports, had its music, uh, and had all that stuff due to this fact that industrialization and urbanization brought people to a city center in order to make this happen, right? So that's what I have for the chapter 18. There's a lot covered in here, but I think that I hope that there's some familiarity in this chapter uh, to maybe your own experience, your own family's experience. But to me, this represents kind of the growth of the American modern city, the development of the American modern city, and kind of gives us new ways or new lenses to think about our own predicaments within cities today. Hope you found it helpful, and I will talk to you soon.